positive organizational scholarship in health. And today we have someone who's right here in our own backyard. We have Professor Peter Ubel, and we are so excited to have him. Janet and I have been waiting to hear from him just based on what his blogs are about. But Peter today, his topic is transplants, colostomies, and kidney failure, reassessing goals in the face of adversity. And as you notice, he has copies of his book on the table for us to browse through. But what Peter is going to share with us is, you know, how can adversity turn out to focus people? How do some people thrive? What becomes important? How do you learn how to live with adversity? So at this point, I'd like to turn over the mic to Peter, and we look forward to learning more about his knowledge and what he's been doing.
Such a great room for like interactivity and everything. I want to tell some stories and weave them together with some science, or as my basic science colleagues at the medical school would say, pseudoscience, and tell you a little bit about some of my thoughts about what happens when we encounter adversity in our lives, and the kind of resilience some people can show in the face of adversity, and what we can learn, what we more generally can learn from that, how these people respond to adversity, maybe bring it to our own lives and make the most out of our own lives, but also maybe even think of how to transform workplaces with some of these concepts in mind. So that's what I'll try to do. I want to start off with a story. This was back in about 1998 when I was at the University of Pennsylvania on the faculty. And I used to play tennis every week with Scott McClure, who, like me, is a primary care physician who does research most of the time, who is obsessed with sports and family and work. And we played tennis every week. I usually won. That day, in fact, I had thrashed him. My forehands were insanely powerful. You can see I'm a pretty well-built guy. Well, it turns out that my forehand might not have been as strong. The grip on his racket was coming loose. So Scott turns that in at the front desk on the way out, and we arranged to play the next week. I get an email from Scott later, can't make it that week. I email him the following week to set up another time to play. Still kind of begs off. Now I'm getting a little surprised because Scott almost never misses an opportunity for athletics. When he was an internal medicine resident in Boston, working 100-plus hours a week in a hospital, he managed to train for and qualify for the Boston Marathon. So this guy always found time for sport. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I do. Whoop, it turned off. Sorry. It's back on. Can you hear better now? All right, so Scott had begged off playing tennis for me a couple times, and then I ran into him in a meeting, and we walked across campus together, and as I was giving him grief for not playing tennis, he looked at me and said, "Peter, I have fasciculations." Now, fasciculations, for those who don't know, are tiny little muscle ripplings you can see under the skin, almost like your skin is doing the wave. They're not strong enough muscle contractions to cause a spasm or even a tremor, just enough to move the skin. To a physician like me, fasciculations mean pretty much one thing. They mean Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. And so as I processed this information, we walked a little further across campus. I didn't say anything. Scott repeated himself. "Peter," he said, "I have fasciculations." And at that time, I thought, I'm walking with someone who's terminally ill, and one of my best friends. And it was an awful, awful moment, seared into my consciousness. Well, to get to the end, not the end of the story's not over. I'll let you know, it's now been about 11 years since then. Scott did turn out to have ALS, a particularly rapid form of it, in fact. He is still alive 11 years later. He uses a EEG cap he wears to control a computer so that he can type 6 words a minute to direct his research lab at Penn, where he still works on faculty, and to send emails to his kids so he can continue to parent them. And he's managing to thrive despite an illness that I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy. And so I want to talk a little bit about how someone can thrive in that kind of a situation, and why many of us imagine that if we were in that same situation, we would not thrive, because that's a lot of what I'm interested in. Why do we mispredict these kinds of things? That's Scott. Around that time, he was in his early 40s. He had 2 teenage kids at home. And I'll tell you more about Scott as we move along. So I want to talk a little bit about how the fact that many people will emotionally adapt to some pretty serious adversity. Specifically, I'm going to talk about chronic illness and disability. That many other people will mispredict their own ability to adapt to the same circumstances. And then there's some lessons to learn from this. Now, let's suppose I wanted to find out what it was like to have kidney failure. To go into dialysis center 3 times a week, be plugged into a machine like this, have your blood run in and out of the machine for about 4 hours at a time to cleanse your blood from impurities, to not be able to drink much liquid in a given day for fear that you couldn't process that liquid and you'd have fluid in your lungs, die of heart failure maybe, that if you ate too many bananas you'd have a potassium level that would get dangerously high. What would it be like to have kidney failure? Well, it turns out if you ask people with kidney failure, they're told they're quite happy. Now the question is, can we believe them? Well, I'm not saying that people might lie to me about that. People might lie, and that's their right to do, I guess. What I'm saying is people may not be able to give an accurate answer, and here's why. Norbert Schwartz, who is here at Ross School and over in psychology, did a study once where he asked people to fill out a survey, but he was running low on surveys, he said. So he sent them over to the copy machine and said, just copy the first 2 pages of the survey, then come back and fill it out. And he arranged for half of them to find a dime at the copy machine, by random half of them. Then they'd come back, and the first question on the survey was, thinking overall about your life, how happy are you? And the people who found that dime were significantly happier than the people who hadn't found a dime. Now, their lives aren't better. It's just that they got put in this tiny little good mood, and when they had to answer this question thinking overall about their life, since none of us keep a running tab on our well-being, that biased their response. That makes sense? So imagine that a research assistant of mine walks into a dialysis center, chats a woman up about her grandkids, pays her $25 to fill out a survey, and the first question on the survey is, how happy are you? Do you think you might get the wrong answer? So we actually did some research where we wanted to get rid of this problem people have of telling you global estimates of their happiness. And we decided to find out just moment-to-moment happiness. We sent dialysis patients home with Palm Pilots, back when those still existed, that were programmed to beep every 90 minutes or so throughout the waking hours, and asked them, how happy are you at this moment in time? Might ask them, how are you in a very pleasant mood to a very unpleasant mood? And we didn't ask them to say overall in their lives how happy they were. We wanted to know at that moment in time. And then over the course of a week, we get all kinds of readings about their mood, and we can find out where their mood tends to run. We gave these Palm Pilots also to healthy patients, healthy people, who were matched by age, race, education, and gender to those people with kidney failure. And we tried to see what their moods would be like. So what do you think, just take a guess, on a -2 to +2 scale, over the course of a week, what do you think a healthy person's moods run at, on average? -1. Okay. Yeah, I guess if it was Michigan winter, maybe. This is healthy people, right? Any other guesses? Was that's your guess is 1? Or you were just raising? Okay, 1? 0, so run around neutral. So on average, we've got about a neutral. What about people who have kidney failure? 2. So you think they'll be happier? No, you don't know, but we can find out. How many people think that patients with kidney failure will be happier than healthy people? Okay. How many think they'll be about the same? How many think they'll be less happy? Okay. So you're a very strange crowd. Or you're lying to me and you're trying to guess what I'm really found. Yeah, I don't know which combination of the two. Okay. Well, we've asked these people. We said, what do you think your moods are like? We had them predict their moods before we had them carry those Palm Pilots. And they both said, closer to 1 than to 0 on that scale. If anything, the patients said that, maybe predicted a little greater happiness, like this room seemed to think they would, than the healthy people we're calling controls. That's what they predicted. Well, then we actually gave them the Palm Pilots and tried to see what would happen. And what we found is both of their predictions are pretty accurate. There are tiny little differences we could talk about, but really, these groups were indistinguishable in their moods. They were generally in positive moods more often than negative moods, and that's pretty common in human beings. We tend to live on the positive. When you get into negative moods, it feels bad. You have a lot of motivation to try to find a way to feel better. And so people tend to get rid of negative moods if possible. We had other measures of mood, positive mood, negative mood, that we took over the week, indistinguishable between the two groups. So the happiness, based, and by happiness I mean moment-to-moment moods of dialysis patients, by the way, so sick, they have a 20% annual mortality rate. And their moods indistinguishable from healthy controls. Now, you ask, what's going on here? Maybe they're not so happy. And maybe what we have is what I call the Spinal Tap Problem. And that's this idea, as if I need to explain this analogy anymore. There was a scene in Spinal Tap, a mockumentary about this rock band, where this guy is showing off his loudspeakers. And he tells everyone, unlike most loudspeakers, mine go to 11. Because other ones just go to 10. And if you want it to be louder, this one you can crank to 11. And then Rob Reiner, who's supposedly the interviewer, says, well, couldn't they be just as loud and just call the loudest, still call it 10? They wouldn't be any louder. But then they wouldn't be 11, he says. So when you answer these kinds of questions, how happy are you on a 0 to 100 happiness scale? Why 70 might not be the same as your 70. And so we always have to worry that we're not capturing, we can't compare groups well because they're using the scale differently. So I'm just going to show you again, this is the pseudoscience part of the talk, that we did some research to look into this problem. We took patients either with lung disease or with diabetes. We decided we were going to not only measure, what do you think, so on the left, here's people with lung disease, okay? And we ask them, rate your quality of life. And across the scale, 0 to 100 scale, they think lung disease would be an 80, say, and other people think it would be a 20. Differences are never that big. I'm exaggerating for illustration. And you'd say, gee, people don't realize that it's not so bad to have lung disease. But in this case, we have condition A, B, C, D, and E, all other kinds of health states, say, or other considerations in life. They rated them all the same. This just shows, if this were the case, that people with lung disease have unique understanding of their own situation, but they use the scale the same way everyone else does. That's one way you could get a different answer for lung disease from patients and non-patients. Hope that made sense. Another possibility is that lung patients say, I'm 80 out of 100, and the other general public says, if I had lung disease, it would be a 30 out of 100. But every other thing you ask them about, they give different numbers. They're just using the scale differently. Now, I'm not so sure we're getting real different answers here as much as we're just using the scale differently. So we did a study to try to find out what was going on when you find differences between how people with conditions rate them and how the general public says they would rate them. What we did was this is a diabetes example. We said, here's a description of someone with diabetes. What do you think their quality of life is on a 0 to 100 scale? People with diabetes gave it about a 74. People who didn't have diabetes thought it'd be worse. They gave it about a 64. They didn't realize what the quality of life would be like with diabetes, we say, right? But are they using the scale the same way? Well, we had them rate having emphysema. And the people with diabetes, people without diabetes, rated emphysema exactly the same way. So the differences of opinion was about the lung disease, what the patients had experience with, and not about some other disease. If you look across all these items, we had them rate not just about health states, we had them rate what their quality of life would be like if they had a nasty boss, if they had dandruff, if they had a nasty boss with dandruff, all these different kinds of things. And they basically used the scale the same way. The nasty boss with dandruff got a really bad rating, by the way. We didn't have that. We had them just look at health items, and all the other health items were rated the same, as were the non-health items. And what this is, I'm just trying to tell you is this. If you ask someone with an illness or disability to say what their life is like, ask someone without it to guess what their life would be like, you get different answers often. And and I will say it's not just because they're using the scale differently. It's not just that spinal tap problem. There are real differences of opinion about what their life would be like. And I think it's because the group with the condition in question has adapted to it and recognized some amount of that adaptation, some amount of it. Now, I'm not going to say that people with specific illnesses or disabilities have great insight, perfect insight, into how well they've adapted. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of why I'm not sure of that. So These, remember, when we gave them the Palm Pilot, these are the moods they reported on average across that week. Well, we asked those same people, we said to the healthy people, suppose you'd had kidney failure. How do you think you would have answered this Palm Pilot? They imagine being in a negative mood majority of their waking hours. I would say they mispredicted the moods of people with kidney failure. Make sense? But we asked people with kidney failure, we said, imagine you had never had any problems with your kidneys. What do you think your moods would be like? They imagined a level of positive mood that was significantly greater than healthy people experienced. So I think both groups are misperceiving reality. Both are underappreciating emotional adaptation. That people with chronic kidney failure largely adapt emotionally to that, pretty serious disease, and they don't realize how much they've adapted. By emotional adaptation, I'm talking about something bad happens that might take you down for a while, and you, over time, can recover some. You show that kind of resilience. They underestimate how much they've recovered. Now, this is not a phenomenon that's just here, that's relevant just to aging, to illness and disability. It's something that happens also as we perceive happiness across our lifespan as we age, which all of us are doing. Some faster than others. When Pete Townsend was in his 20s, he coined the lyric, "Hope I Die Before I Get Old," for The Who. And you can see at the time he was taking major drugs, based look on his eyes. But that was a pretty common belief among young people. God, it would stink to get old, right? Now you actually find Pete Townsend now, or recently, he actually says he's as happy as he's ever been. He clearly learns how to hide any current drug use with sunglasses. But he actually says he's thriving in an age where he probably wished he would have been dead when he was 20. So what's going on here? People think, and was Townsend alone in thinking that as you get older, you're going to get less happy? And is he alone because of financial resources in getting so happy as he gets older? Well, here's what it turns out. If you measure the happiness in a bunch of 30-year-olds and a bunch of 70-year-olds, the typical 70-year-old is going to be happier than a typical 30-year-old. Does that jibe? Why do you think that's true? Do you think it's true?
They're more in charge of their own time.
Mm-hmm.
But begin to learn that we have a choice.
There's a lot of things that come with age that so when you think of, when you're 30 years old and you're thinking of being 70, what do you think about? Yeah, gray hair, achy joints, wrinkly skin, right? But when you get to that age, what you've got is you've got some wisdom from life experiences, you've learned, right? So let me ask you this. So what do you think happens to positive mood across the lifespan? Do you think positive mood increases from age 30 to 70? I see a lot of nodding. Anybody think it doesn't? Nope, everyone thinks it does. Yeah.
One question that keeps coming up to me as you're talking about this is what people report as their level of happiness.
Right.
Is it consistent? Is it just basically when people who are self-reporting that they're reasonably happy with some kind of illness, they were like that beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
Basically just maintain whatever your...
Mm-hmm. There are people who talk about a hedonic treadmill, which is the idea that no matter what your circumstances, you just come back to a baseline of happiness. And yeah, and so if you were trying to figure out the difference in happiness across people, you're measuring how happy they were and try to figure out what would predict it. If you knew how happy their identical twin was, you'd explain 50% of the variance of the difference from one person to another. So their genetics is about 50% of a contributor. So there's definitely, some people, anyone who's had kids, some of them come out happy out of the womb, some come out a little crankier. And we know friends like that. They always seem to find a way to say the glass is only 7/8 full or something, So there's definitely personality, genetic causes. But circumstances would seem to matter too. And in fact, when the unemployment rate goes up in a country, happiness goes down. Put someone in bad enough circumstances, it's going to change their mood. People who start at a higher baseline will be higher than people who start at a lower baseline. Then the question is, how much do they each come back up? and all that, right? So what it turns out is, as you age now, if it was just about baseline happiness, it would be flat, right? So something is happening across age that's causing global happiness reports to go up. And what I'm going to tell you is it's not positive mood. If you just used those Palm Pilots and measured positive mood in 30-year-olds and 70-year-olds, they'd be basically the same. What's happened is that for 70-year-olds, they experience less negative mood. It's a reduction in negative mood. Now, what I'm talking about is, watch any MTV reality series for 5 minutes, and you'll see the slightest insult. And it's days of just, I can't believe she said that about me, right? Or worried that someone doesn't like you anymore, and you just fret and fret. They just, all these little things that we've all learned as we age to kind of let roll off our shoulders, glomming right onto the, right? And so part of aging is that people learn how to edit things out. Here's another example of that. You show people video images, and you ask them later some test of memory. How much do they remember of different images? And you'll find out, on average, older people remember fewer of the images than younger. Okay, that's age-related memory loss, right? Well, no, this is actually early aging people who actually have pretty well intact memory. So what's going on here? Well, it turns out they remember the positive images, the positive emotional images, just as well as the younger people do. But they forget the negative images. So they have selective memory and probably selective attention problems. They don't concentrate on those images. They kind of ignore them more, and then they don't remember them well later. But there seems to be like an editing process that goes on. And I think that's part of how we get happier with age. Okay? So, yeah. Right. Sure. Yeah. So what I'm talking about now, so there's different kinds of happiness. One is just how happy you are in your life, how satisfied are you with your life. Separate type of measure of happiness would be, let me just measure your mood right now, and I can actually tell whether you're positive or negative mood. I could probably map that to cortisol levels or to facial EMG tracings, things like that. And so sometimes I'm going to go back and forth on that sloppily, and I apologize. There's no doubt that when people think globally, what is my striving for in life? What makes me happy? It's not always about mood. That for many people, they like the struggle. They like being in that bad mood because it means they have something to fight. And so that can be a part of that kind of happiness. Now, in the meantime, if you measure their moment-to-moment moods, they just might be people who kind of cranky, but they're happily cranky. Yeah, it actually makes sense. That's just their nature, and they often can solve problems better when they're in that kind of a mood. I think there are many. I mean, the artist, struggling artist, is the kind of extreme example of it. That's where they get their inspiration from. So I definitely that's not inconsistent to think of people who find some kind of happiness even with pretty negative mood. Those are different things. And in fact, I'll be talking a little bit about that distinction between mood and broader happiness. But the reason I'm giving this aging example is not just to say we get happier with age. Because what I'm talking about here is people mispredicting things like adaptation. When I ask 30-year-olds, what do you think, how happy do you think the typical 30-year-old is? How happy do you think the typical 70-year-old is? This is what they think. They mispredict, just like Pete Townsend did, the trajectory of happiness across lifespan. But of course, they don't know about the wonders of aging, right? And they think of the old people kind of withering away. They don't think of my personal hero, Jack LaLanne. This is a picture he's taken in his early 90s. He can still kick my butt. And who says, even at that advanced age, he talks about how great his life is. He says, I have sex almost every day. Almost Monday, almost Tuesday, almost... So they don't think of aging that you can have this very vital kind of aging. But what about people who are older then? Well, it turns out they have the same exact beliefs about happiness across the lifespan as younger people. So the theme I want to get on here is this. We don't always predict what will make us happy or unhappy in life. And even when we've experienced certain circumstances, like kidney failure or aging, we still may not have accurate insights about how those experiences have influenced our happiness. I want to give you another example of this phenomenon back to kidney failure. We measured the quality of life of people who were waiting for kidney transplants at the University of Pennsylvania. We asked them to predict what they thought their quality of life would be 1 year after a successful transplant. We found them after the transplant, measured their quality of life, and said, tell us what your quality of life was like before you got the transplant. And there's a whole lot of mispredicting going on. Just to let you know, they thought their quality of life would rise from 66 to 91. They were pretty close and went to 83. They thought they'd be able to travel a lot more. It's hard to travel outside of town overnight when you have to come back to dialysis 3 times a week. So they thought they'd more than double how much travel they did. But after that transplant, there was almost no increase in how much they traveled. They thought that they'd be able to finally get back to gainful employment because they wouldn't have to go to the dialysis center and they'd be feeling healthier. There was almost no change in employment, which is tragic. We need to do better at that. They thought their energy level would be basically maxed out after this transplant. They did get a major improvement, not quite as much as they thought. So that's the mispredicting going on. I think in this case they made the right decision to get the transplant. But it still shows what a poor job we do of helping people understand how their lives will change if their health changes. Now here's the more interesting part of the study. It's the rememberings. Remember, they thought at the beginning, when they were 66 out of 100, that they'd rise to 91 out of 100 with a successful transplant. Well, we found them very shortly after the transplant, surveyed them again. Their quality of life had risen to 78, but they already remembered being a 57 before the transplant. When we found them at 6 months, their quality of life had risen to 80, but they remembered being 55. And by the time we found them at a year, their quality of life had risen to 83, but they remembered being a 48. All of a sudden, they remembered being completely miserable before the transplant. They've gained even more points than they thought they would gain by misremembering. And in fact, one famous psychologist who studies this phenomena says, you can always get what you want by misremembering what you had. So that's a little life lesson there for you, right? I was so miserable before I got married. Right? That's a great way to have a happy marriage. I was so miserable back then. I don't know if I was or not, but it's a great way to convince yourself you're happier now. So experience doesn't always teach us what makes us happy or not. So that's kind of the theme of that little section. Now, one of the other phenomena that can have a surprising influence on happiness is uncertainty. It turns out uncertainty is an awful thing. One of the greatest impediments to well-being is uncertainty. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Scott McClure and his story. Remember, I told you that Scott told me that walking across the campus that he had these fasciculations. Turns out about 10 years earlier, he'd had kind of similar weird things going on in his arms. Not exactly fasciculations, but they'd gone away over time, and no one knew what they were. So he had partly this in his head. He's thinking, maybe this is that same thing again. At the same time, Scott was one of the smartest, he is one of the smartest physicians I've ever met. He knew what the differential diagnosis of fasciculations was. He had no illusions that he was avoiding this terrible fate. So he, on the one hand, he was pretty certain he had Lou Gehrig's disease. On the other hand, maybe there's this weird chance that I don't. So what did he have to do? Well, he had to wait until the diagnosis became more definitive before he told people. He told me very early on because we played tennis every week. And then I became kind of his weekly lunch partner, and we'd kind of talk about how life was going because we couldn't play tennis anymore. He told his jogging buddies shortly after that, when he couldn't keep up with them on a jog, he could explain why he couldn't. And now he had another bit of a circle. But he didn't tell his kids. He didn't tell his parents. He talked about it with his wife. But he had this he was actually ended up socially isolating himself from a lot of people. That's actually one of the lessons of that was, and I talk about it in the book, social interaction is a huge part of well-being. And so when you're experiencing some kind of circumstance that isolates you, or maybe makes you feel stigmatized, that's one of the biggest tolls it can bring to you. Scott self-imposed a little bit of isolation on himself because he didn't want to freak people out with a diagnosis that later might be taken away. And he'd be like, sorry, I guess I'm okay. So he ended up being more isolated than he likes. He also couldn't get a definitive diagnosis. He went into the neurology appointment and said to the neurologist, tell me the truth. I can take whatever it is, but I just need to hear what's going on. And the doctor's like, oh, I just don't know. I don't know what you have. He says, well, tell me a differential diagnosis. Differential diagnosis, doctor talked for. What are the different diseases that could cause my symptoms? Oh, it's premature to have a differential diagnosis. Bullshit, Scott said. You know, I know the differential diagnosis. I just want to know if there's anything else on the differential that I don't know about. And the doctor wouldn't even give him one possible diagnosis, including Lou Gehrig's disease, that this could be. Scott was so livid after that. But what it ended up doing was increasing the sense of uncertainty. And from that, he struggled greatly. He had a hard time sleeping at night. He he was struggling. The guy who's one of the most optimistic, positive guys I ever met would talk to me about how tearful he was and how difficult this was. The same time, he had this weird kind of certainty and positivity going on. I remember eating lunch with him around that time. We were at a Chinese restaurant, and he choked a little bit on some of the food he was eating. Scott was starting to have a little bit of slurring of his speech and a little bit of swallowing problems. So he was choking on the food, and I remember kind of looking down like, I don't want to have him notice that I noticed what's going on. He sees me. He just catches me and says, "Peter, what do you think is going to be first? A wheelchair, a ventilator, or a feeding tube?" Ouch. I mean, it was like morbid humor. But he had to be, partly that's Scott. He's right in your face with the humor. Partly he was like, don't deny that what's going on. Don't pretend you didn't see that. He needed to acknowledge what was going on. So he had that fatalism going on right away. But it wasn't until he went back into the neurologist, a new neurologist this time, and had the final tests done that he knew the diagnosis. And at that point in time, all of a sudden, he started, I think, really adapting emotionally. You could feel the difference in his mood because now there was no doubt. Feeding tubes, wheelchairs, and ventilators were in his future. But he knew what his future was. Let me give you a quick side story about how difficult uncertainty can be. In World War II, if you lived in central London, you could expect to be bombed every night by the Germans. The sirens would go off, you'd head into the shelters, you had some uncertainty, you didn't know if you'd survive or not, or the building would be bombed or not. But you knew every night that was going to happen. If you lived in the outskirts of London, you kind of, like every couple of weeks, they'd happen to be flying out in your direction and drop their last few bombs in your direction, in your way. But you might go 2 weeks without sirens. Stomach ulcer rates were higher in the outskirts of London than in central London. And I think it was partly because of the uncertainty. You never knew when they were going to strike, and that drove people crazy. When you knew every night to expect this terrible thing, somehow people resigned themselves to it. Right? Yeah.
Is it a matter of control and adapting? So I know they're going to bomb every night, so I can adapt to fear.
Yeah. I think Scott knew what was going to come with his ALS. And when he finally had the definitive diagnosis, he was able to just knew what to expect and prepare for it. There were things that did come that surprised him, and those were the hardest times he had. I think that a comparison would be another terrible neurologic disease would be multiple sclerosis, MS. You can go years without a flare, and you don't know what to expect. It's a better prognosis, and so objectively it's a better disease, but I bet it's emotionally harder for a lot of people because they don't know what to expect. I'll give you another example of that phenomenon, actually. Colostomies. So this study just came out this week. It's gotten a little bit of media attention. We measured the life satisfaction and quality of life of people who had colostomies. So they had part of their colon removed because of disease in the colon, and they now had basically to poop in a pouch. As it turns out, sometimes that's a permanent thing. There's nothing the doctors will ever be able to do to reconnect you. For other patients, because of just the way their biology is, they can get reconnected after 5-6 months when things heal up. So we found people who just had these new colostomy operations, and we said, did the doctors say this was going to be temporary or permanent? And then we followed them over time. What's better? If you had to choose, how many people would choose the permanent colostomy? How many would choose the temporary? Right, I know you'd choose no colostomy, probably, right? Well, over those first 6 months, it turns out that it's the people with the permanent colostomy whose life satisfaction increases. And the people with the temporary colostomy, their life satisfaction actually decreases a little bit. If you look at overall quality of life, people with the permanent colostomy get an increase in their quality of life. People with the temporary, pretty flat to maybe a little bit of a decline. What I think is going on is this. When you know this is your fate, your permanent fate, you have no choice but to deal with it. Now, some people do better than others. There's variation in how well people adapt to these things. When it's temporary, I don't have to get used to this. I'm going to get rid of it someday. In fact, I'm not sure I want to go out except among my best friends because I don't want people to know about this. If I hide out for 6 months, they never need to know. I'm worried that there'll be a little gas smell coming out of here, or I might have an accident. I don't want to have that happen around medium friends, right? So you can imagine just withdrawing and just hating this thing because you know someday you're going to get rid of it. And therefore, you don't actually emotionally adapt. And the people where it was a permanent fate, as you see, they thrived compared to the other group. So that kind of, in a sense, we think of this as the dark side of hope. when you're holding out hope for your situation to improve, it might make you not do the best with this current situation. So in Scott's case, when he got that diagnosis, he improved in his well-being. Let me just quickly tell you a quick email he sent around that time. It's when he announced to everyone else who didn't already know that he had Lou Gehrig's disease. He told people what he had. He said, "For the past 6 months, I've noticed a slow but inexorable loss of muscle strength. Not until last week, however, was the diagnosis official. I have for the entire time realized the nature of this illness. The uncertainty of 3 months of watchful waiting amplified the anxiety in our lives." And he went on to say, but getting this news finally, he can accept it and move on. He then challenged somebody to play me in tennis and beat me because he was still mad that he hadn't beaten me for a while. And he basically said, "It's terrible news, but I'm ready to move forward. I hope you're willing to go on this journey with me." It was a very powerful email, and it showed what happened with resolution of uncertainty. Now, so that second theme really is about uncertainty. How can it get in the way of well-being? If I don't come around to that point again at the end, think about this when you're thinking about workplace environments and stuff. Think about how people suffer under uncertainty. Sometimes it's better to know bad news than to wonder if there's going to be bad news. And I would guess, if you're working at a place where there's layoffs coming up, that's got to be one of the hardest things to happen, right? And so uncertainty, think about that as a way to improve the workplace environment. Now, what can we learn about adversity that will improve our lives? I think a lot of it has to do with how adversity can focus us on goals. And so I actually want to tell you about another email I received. This is one I was talking with someone about before the talk that I received in 2000 from a man who was an engineering professor here and an entrepreneur. His name was Andy Crawford. And the email basically said, "Peter, this is me. I really liked your book, Pricing Life," so this is a very strange guy. This is a book I wrote about healthcare rationing. He's one of 5 people that have read it. He said, "Due in part to your book, I'm using the money I saved by foregoing a bone marrow transplant to start a series of healthcare clinics in Bangladesh." Whoa, that's a lot in one sentence. So let me tell you a little bit about Andy. Andy was 50 years old at the time he was told he had bone marrow failure, and that his bone marrow was no longer making red blood cells, white blood cells, or platelets, that without a bone marrow transplantation, he would probably die within 5 years and would slowly get weaker along that time. Transfusions could help a little bit. With bone marrow transplantation, a very brutal procedure where you bring someone to death's door and then try to pull them back at the last minute, he had a 10% chance of survival. So Andy decided he didn't want to go through the bone marrow transplant. Further, he thought it was crazy, this is Andy's view, not mine, it was crazy for society, for Blue Cross, for whoever, to spend $100,000 to give a 50-plus-year-old guy a 10% chance of survival. He thought that was kooky. So he decided, okay, I got 5 years left. I'm going to focus on this, this, and this in my life. Oh, and one more thing. I want to show the world what you can really do with $100,000. So he took $100,000 of his own dollars and said, with that money, I'm going to give thousands of people health care in Bangladesh. And he worked at a T-shirt company he ran, and a lot of the garment workers were in Bangladesh, so he knew the situation out there well. And he and his son basically spent the next few years going back and forth and negotiating ways to get primary health care clinics set up in Bangladesh. How many people here think if they were given 5 years to live, they'd be starting health care clinics in Bangladesh? I mean, that's stunning, right? Andy is a stunning guy. But Andy didn't do it until he had 5 years left to live. Adversity in that case, the fact he had a death sentence, focused him on what was most important in his life. And he decided, here are the goals I have time to accomplish, and he went after them like a maniac. I mean, it was absolutely inspiring. He was going to accomplish these things, and the short lifespan he had left motivated him only all that much more to try to do that. Research on goal setting and happiness often breaks goals up into a couple different ways. One is it says, are the goals intrinsic or extrinsic? So an intrinsic goal would be, I want to study this history course so I can, it's like my microphone went off, so you know what's going on. I want to study history so I better understand how Nazi Germany could have happened. I just need to understand the world better. That's an intrinsic goal. An extrinsic goal would be, I need to study history so that I get a good grade and my parents don't get that. Someone else is studying that
that goal for you. People who are pursuing goals, intrinsic goals, are not only more likely to achieve the goals than other people, but even when you look at who did achieve the goals, they're happier in the process. So find goals in your own life that are intrinsically meaningful to you, and you'll do better. Find goals in the workplace that are intrinsically meaningful for everybody at the workplace, and that workplace is more likely to thrive. Andy Crawford had 5 years left to live. He had no choice but to pursue intrinsically meaningful goals. I think, by the way, that's another reason happiness increases with age. Because all of a sudden your goals change to where you're like, I'm doing what I care about. I'm not bothering with BS anymore. I'm doing what matters to me. I'm spending time with people that I care about, that I want to spend time with. I'm not going to deal with people that I don't want to spend time with. So I think, how do we, when we don't have a 5-year death sentence, how do we still live with that same sense of urgency to pursue intrinsically meaningful goals instead of extrinsic ones? Another way that goal researchers study this, they talk about whether a mental orientation of the goal is positive or negative. So sports analogy might help here. You could be there in the last seconds of the basketball game, and you make that free throw to win the game. You could be thinking, I better not miss this free throw. Better not miss this free throw. That's a negative framing. Or you could be, got to switch, nothing but net, nothing but net. Well, they're the same goal, just framed a different way, right? The positive framing makes people more likely to achieve the goal, and it makes them happier along the way. And to take another sports analogy, I think of figure skating. So Michelle Kwan, I just love the way this woman skated when she was out there. She's an absolutely elegant skater. 2 Olympics in a row, she came in as the prohibitive favorite to win the gold medal. Both times she came into the last night of the competition with a big lead. So the gold medal was hers to lose. She skated that way. She skated trying not to make mistakes. You could see it in the way she skated. And both times she was beaten by a 14-year-old girl who had nothing to lose, everything to gain, and just wanted to skate the best performance of her life. So again, when you're pursuing goals in life, try to think of how to make them same thing framed a different way, but think of the positive framing, and you're probably going to do better. And I think that's what Andy taught me. All right, this is a really pleasant-looking slide. I'm going to play about 2 nightmares I have. One sleeping, one waking. The waking nightmare was this. It was December in West Virginia, and after 4 days of hard rain, my friend George and I decided to go whitewater canoeing on a Class 3 rapid, which has now become pretty much Class 4. I'm a very inexperienced whitewater canoeing person. This is the dumbest thing ever did. To make things dumber, when we came up to a dam, instead of pulling out our canoe, walking around, putting back down and going, we decided to jump. So we went over the dam, and instead of just having the front kind of go over and we kept going, we ended up kind of going sideways and flipping over. So now we had the dam over here, water pouring over the dam, our canoe here, and us on the other side of the canoe from this raging river and raging water coming over the dam. And we weren't moving at all. Incredibly powerful rapids, and we weren't moving at all. And at the time, I didn't know enough to know why. We were caught in hydraulic. The water comes down from the dam, curls up, and that's what's holding us back, so we weren't even going downstream. So we sat there, and the first time just like chilled out. I'm a strong swimmer. I think I'll live forever. About a minute into this, I noticed that the rope in front of the canoe is tangled around my arm, and now I'm realizing I am not in control of this situation. Now, I have not been in control of this situation for a while. Now, I realize that I'm not in control of the situation. I'm in trouble. At some point, I started realizing I'm spending more time underwater than up above, and I struggled to get back up. And I realized that I was losing the battle. And then I had time to sit and think that I had just put myself, I basically killed myself. That for just the sake of adrenaline high, I had ended my life. I wondered where they'd find my body. I wondered who would tell my then girlfriend, now wife. The last words she said to me at 4 a.m. when we left were, be careful. I basically had the most powerful, sad emotions I'd experienced in my entire life. And it was because I had so much I wanted to live for, and I knew it was not going to happen. I survived. I could feel the tension in the room. It turns out that I got pulled back far enough that I literally got taken down. And at that point, I knew it was over. I just with the final bit of just disbelief, I just kind of relaxed, got pulled under, and just thought, I'll never have another thought again. I was just stunned. And then all of a sudden, I was breathing again. I couldn't believe it. I was breathing. I yelled out, I'm alive, I'm alive. I could not believe it. And now I better get ashore, big rock heading away. So I swim out shore, get up there, start catching my breath. I look up, my friend George is gone. And then he pops up. Same exact thing happens to him. And he looks, he sees me, and he goes, you're alive, you're alive. So I was all about me, he's all about him. So I helped pull George ashore. We spent the rest of the day, well, we went and got the canoe. Then floated downstream. We spent the rest of the day as we're driving back to Pennsylvania. We had to stop every 15 minutes to pee because the water in our lungs was getting reabsorbed. I mean, that's we drowned. And we compared notes. And both of us agreed this was the saddest we've ever felt in our life. And I talked about how sad I was that I wouldn't have all these things to experience in life. And George said he felt really sad because he had a 1-year-old boy at home. He couldn't believe he wouldn't be able to experience his child. And so I came away from that thinking we both just felt equally sad, terrible. Second night, this is actually a dream. This is after Scott got diagnosed with ALS. And I spent one night and I slept that night. I dreamt I had ALS. And once again, the powerfulness of the emotions was absolutely staggering. It was a dream. I almost never remember my dream. And the focus of my dream was that I wouldn't see my 2 boys growing up, and that I couldn't see their dad. And I woke up crying. And I also woke up and thought, George had a worse experience than I did that day. Because not being able to be a parent, all of a sudden, that was so much bigger than just my own life. And this is why what I'm talking about today is about meaning and purpose. If you measure moment-to-moment mood of people with little kids in the house, you will find very high levels of negative mood. If you want to look at it, measuring mood, there's almost no worse time in your life than when you have little kids. Adolescents, I've been told, will probably be even worse. In fact, marital happiness. Before you're married, you're up here, you get married, really happy, diapers. Marital happiness plunges. So stay married, they get into the years I'm in, post-diapers, pre-adolescence. Marital happiness starts coming back up. Adolescence hits, it plummets down again. And for those who survive, after the kids leave, marital happiness is actually basically where it was, early part of marriage. So you don't have kids to improve your moment-to-moment. So think about that. There's nothing in my life that's giving me a better sense of meaning and purpose than motivated. Nothing that's got me more motivated to get up at 5 a.m. and get things done, to work hard early in the morning so I can break out early this afternoon, go mountain biking with my 11-year-old. So, those things, so much meaning and purpose. And that's what we want to strive for, not only at home, but at work, is that you want to have that meaning and purpose to strive for. Don't worry about what it means to moment mood. If you're driven by that sense of purpose, that's another type of well-being that I think is more valuable. Scott, this is Scott a few years ago. You can see he's changed a lot. And here's one reason that you could say Scott is thriving. It's because of social support. Scott's wife, Lynn, is a renowned physical therapist, actually, does research, internationally known for her research on knee rehabilitation. She's a total brainiac, amazing woman. And as a physical therapist, if you're going to get ALS, not a bad person to be married to. She's got grad students who come and live in her basement. She's got other ones who come over in the morning to help get Scott out of bed and washed up. She's got other ones who come at night and help put him back to bed. The amount of social support is staggering. In addition, Scott is a researcher, gets supplements with grants to cover expenses. For having a nurse come to his lab every day and take care of him while he runs his basic science research lab. He studies the molecular models of cocaine addiction in rats. And you might not even know that rats have problems with cocaine addiction. So there's a lot of evidence in the medical literature that people who get more social support do better than people who don't. And that's true. But it's really only part of the story. These are some of the people who help Scott out. He also likes the fact that a lot of the people who help him out are really healthy and attractive, and he does enjoy that too. He goes out. But it's not just about social support, because The reason Scott is thriving is because he can get something back. If it was all about receive, 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 he'd be miserable. What keeps him going is he gets up in the morning, he goes into a lab where he really thinks. He can find molecular keys that help people, millions of people, and no longer suffer from addiction. That's pretty powerful motivation. In addition, he's got a family. And when he was diagnosed with disease, boys were like, I think, 12 and 14 years old. I remember one time being over at his house. I had just moved here, and I went back and visited him. And his older son was 18 now, his younger was 16. And the 16-year-old had just learned how to drive and wanted to go out for the evening. And Mom said, sure, you can, but the driver is really crazy, probably with stuff, and you have your older brother back the car up. And they argued about whether the older brother needed to do that, whether she should go out. There's just this big, huge argument going on, a fair amount of disrespect to Mom. Teenagers. Okay, this is after the happiness part, right? Scott, at this point, can't talk. This was before he had the EEG thing. He was communicating through his computer with an eye tracking device, and it was bugging out. It wasn't working. So he wasn't part of this conversation. Then, just as Noah's about to head out of the house, the computer beeps. Scott has a way of signaling, making a beeping noise when he wants attention. And we look over, and on the computer, he's picked up the words, Noah is grounded. He basically is still the parental enforcer in their house. Mom, as tough as she is in her research minions, she's a pushover as a mom. Scott was the one who laid down the law, and he did not think that Noah was treating Mom with respect. He grounded Noah. I remember he copied me an email that he did when he'd go to his soccer games, where he'd have the directions he gave the kids, and here's how to improve your goaling technique in the game, or here's what you need to think about with the project stuff. He was very involved as a parent. That's why Scott is thriving, because he can still contribute positively in the workplace and at home. And so, while he's thriving, this is Noah now. These kids are amazing kids. Noah is in the grad school at Penn. He would have actually come to Michigan, where there are other people who do the kind of work he does. He studied basically primate behavior and physiology. He ties in basically physiology and psychology of primate behavior. We're primates, by the way, so he's studying indirectly. And he stayed at Penn so he could be near his dad. He's just an amazing guy. And then Alexander actually is